Hello and welcome to The Print. A lot has happened over the past week, of course, and one of these significant developments is that we now have data on electoral bonds, some data, of course. As we know, the Supreme Court in February struck down these bonds as unconstitutional. The Supreme Court asked SBI to stop issuing them immediately, and what it also said is that SBI and ECI need to make this data public. So the Supreme Court set its deadlines. It said that SBI needs to give this data by 6th March, and then the ECI needs to publish this data within the next week. As we know, of course, the SBI missed the deadline. The Supreme Court said, no can do. You have to publish the data. And this is what we have now. Now, what does this data mean for the voters, and why is this development so significant, so interesting? These are some of the questions that we'll be discussing today in this video. For this video, of course, you have me, Apoorva Mandhani, and we have with us a very special guest. We have with us Anjali Bhardwaj, who's the co-convener of National Campaign for People's Right to Information and the founding member of Satark Nagrik Sangathan. And she's also one of the foremost campaigners of the right to information in the country. Thank you so much for joining us, ma'am.
Thank you, Apoorva.
Ma'am, just to start off, for beginners, if you could tell our viewers why this information that we have now is so significant, and maybe if you could talk a little bit about the Supreme Court judgment on how do you think the court took that jurisprudence on people's right to know, the voters' right to know forward, and how it did that?
Sure. So, Apoorva, let's understand that in our democracy, when people go to cast their vote, uh, most of the time people are voting for political parties. Candidates are important, but because of the 10th schedule and several other factors, what people really are voting for are political parties.
Right.
So when we go to cast our vote, it's very important for us to have information. Now, if we talk about funding and sources of funding, we do understand that when large corporates give funds to political parties, it's basically for a quid pro quo because they are working to maximize their profits. So the understanding, therefore, is that if a corporate is giving large sums of money to any political party, they're hoping that they will form the government and then might be able to influence policy, laws, contracts, etc., in the favor of that corporate. So when I go to vote as a voter, I have all these political parties in front of me. I have a right to know who is funding the political party. And if the political party comes to power, who will they work for, therefore?
Right.
So this is a fundamental aspect of a voter's right to know. Now, what has been happening is that there is great anonymity and there is lack of transparency in the funding of political parties. And this is a historic fact. What happened when the electoral bond scheme was brought in was that we were told that this was being brought in to increase transparency in political party funding. But what it ended up doing was exactly the opposite, because the electoral bond scheme, the way it was drafted and the various laws that were changed to bring in and facilitate electoral bonds basically meant that unlimited amounts of money could be donated to political parties through electoral bonds completely anonymously. Right. So as citizens, as voters, we would have no information on who was funding political parties through these electoral bonds, who were people who were actually, or companies who were funding, and also who were they funding to. So voters were kept in the dark. And I think that this is something that the Supreme Court really sort of came down strongly on in its judgment. They declared the electoral bond scheme and the 4 laws that came along with the scheme to facilitate bringing in electoral bonds unconstitutional. The court said that they're unconstitutional on the grounds that they violate Article 19. Article 19(1) basically is our fundamental right to free speech and expression. So if I have to go and express my sort of, support to a political party through my vote, I should have an informed sort of voting, which should be possible and which was made impossible through the electoral bond scheme.
Ma'am, since you mentioned now this data that it helps us establish maybe a form of quid pro quo, does the data that we have in its current form help us do that, or do we need more?
Look, the data that we have now, it's very clear what the Supreme Court asked the SBI to put out. They said that two silos information has to be put out in. One is purchaser data. So who purchased electoral bonds? The list of that is out now, along with the date on which the bond was purchased and the denomination of the bond. So let's remember that the bonds were in various denominations: 1,000 rupees, 10,000 rupees, 1 lakh, 10 lakh, and 1 crore rupees. So this data now is out in the public domain from April 2019 onwards. And the other data which the court ruled should be put out is data related to redeemers. Who actually went and redeemed those bonds? Which was the political party that redeemed bonds? What date did they redeem the bond on, and what was the denomination? Now, what the court has in its latest hearing also said is that bond numbers should also be given, because each bond had a unique alphanumeric number which was visible under the ultraviolet light. So this was basically put there according to the government to be able to do an audit trail. So what the court is saying is that if there was this number, which the government has confirmed that there was, then one should have information about this number, both on the purchaser and on the redeemer side, which will basically mean that people will then be able to do the exact matching. They will be able to know that XYZ purchaser purchased bond number so and so, which was then redeemed by ABC political party. So that entire loop will be closed when that information is provided. The court, of course, has issued notice to the SBI. The matter will be heard again on Monday, and we hope that that information will also be available.
Right. And then that entire thing of quid pro quo can be looked at, if at all, because then we'd have that, like you mentioned, the loop would be complete then. Now, just taking you for a second, taking you back to the Supreme Court judgment, the petitions were filed, the petitions were pending for a while. But during that time, there were certain RTI applications that you and your organization had filed, as I understand. And what was revealed was certain concerns. Not everybody was in favor of these electoral bonds. RBI and EC wasn't. If you could talk a little bit about those concerns that were raised at that time.
Right. So, Apoorva, I'll give a slightly historical background, because that I think is important.
Of course, it's very relevant.
In our country, one of the big problems has been that political party funding has been considered the fountainhead of corruption. The reason being that large companies gave large amounts of cash, unaccounted cash, to political parties, and political parties were not declaring who was giving them that money, not even declaring the cash, all of it that came to them. How was this possible? There's a section in the IT Act which basically says that any donation that is made to a political party under 20,000 rupees, the name of the donor does not have to be disclosed by the political party. So what would typically be done? This was an open secret. Political parties, let's say, would get 100 crores in unaccounted cash from a particular corporate. What they would do is that they would break it down into smaller packets of 19,900 rupees, just do some creative accounting. And they would say that, look, we don't have to disclose the name of our donors because we are not required to under the IT Act. So what was happening was that although money was coming from this one large source, it was being broken up, and citizens had no way of knowing who was funding these political parties. Also, there was generation of black money, which was a huge problem. Now, when the electoral bond scheme was brought, the then finance minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, said on the floor of parliament that this is being brought to increase transparency in political party funding and also to remove black money from the system. So when this was brought in, there was a lot of enthusiasm. People felt that, these were two very laudable objectives. But of course, as always, the devil is in the detail. And when there was consultation that was held with the RBI and the ECI, the regulator of elections, we found out by filing RTI applications, we accessed the communication between the RBI and the Finance Ministry and the communication between the ECI and the Finance Ministry. And both the RBI and the ECI raised very, very serious concerns upon engaging with what the scheme was. And what they said can be captured in 2 or 3 points. One is that they said that these bonds, the way they have been imagined and the scheme was being brought in, will in fact increase black money in the system. And it's very simple how that would happen. The trading of these bonds is prohibited, but there is no safeguard to stop the trading of these bonds. So supposing as a purchaser, I go and from a banking channel, I buy the electoral bonds in my name and I give my KYC details. Yes, that means that I cannot buy these in cash. But if somebody else has cash for a consideration, I can actually sell that bond to that person. They can give me cash, and therefore the money has also been laundered. And then the donor, they can go and give it to the political party that they want to give it to. So the donor is different from the purchaser. So this is actually generating a way of money laundering. This is exactly what was written by the then RBI Governor Urjit Patel in a letter to the finance minister. And he said that, look, all our efforts to fight black money will go to waste. So please don't do this. Don't get the electoral bond scheme and the changes to the various laws that you're making in this form. Another thing that was done, when I say the laws were changed, one of the laws that was changed was the Companies Act. So in the Companies Act, what was said was that only up to 7.5% of the last 3 years of the profits of a company could they donate to a political party. So it wasn't like any company could give unlimited amounts of money to a political party. Why should loss-making companies be giving money to political parties? I mean, they're as it is loss-making. Why should their shareholders want them to fund political parties? So what was said was that 7.5% of the last 3 years of a company's profits is the maximum, the cap on donations that can be made to political parties. This was removed through the amendment to the Companies Act, which basically meant that now shell companies could be set up with the sole purpose of donating funds to political parties. These could be fly-by-night operators, and one would not have a way to track any of this. So the ECI said that, look, shell companies will be brought in. We as regulators will be kept in the dark. We will not know who is funding political parties. And therefore, it's a very bad idea to bring in these bonds. Now, despite all of this, we have communication which we accessed under the RTI law, which shows how the government rode roughshod on these recommendations and went ahead and brought electoral bonds. Now, all of this was then finally there before the Supreme Court, including the responses and the communication we accessed under the RTI Act. And the Supreme Court then looked at all of it, examined it, and said that this is unfortunately a complete scheme for quid pro quo. So this, if one looks at the judgment actually calls this kind of thing clientelism. They say that this is a very, very problematic form of corruption where in a completely anonymous way, there is legalizing of unlimited amount of money being given to political parties, and nobody, no voter, no regulator, banks, they don't know anything who is giving the money and to whom. So this was one of the reasons why the court found all of this also unconstitutional.
Right. In fact, you mentioned the Companies Act amendment and how that could lead to shell companies. And even with the preliminary examination of data that we're doing at the print, we found that a few companies have donated more than way more than how much money they've made in the past few years. And that itself shows how those concerns were absolutely valid. Now, you mentioned what the law was, of course, law has been before the electoral bonds as well, law related to political funding. This, of course, pertains to the disclosures pertain to the disclosures that parties make themselves. And you mentioned the loopholes as well, that they break it down into 19,999. And in fact, one of the reports that I was reading through, it mentioned that BSP hasn't declared any donation over 20,000 for the past several, I think 16 years or so, if I remember it correctly. That's of course about their self-declaration. But what about transparency with regard to RTI? Can a person approach political parties and demand information under RTI about their funding?
So, Apoorva, I'm so glad that you brought this up, because at the moment, the raging debate is that has the Supreme Court judgment taken us back to a very bad system of cash being used? At
Right.
least
In fact, I'm so sorry, I'm just stopping you here. That was my next question and last question, but I'll just add it to this only since you mentioned it, that where does this judgment leave us now? Does it take us back?
Okay, yes. So, there is this concern that is being expressed that, yes, electoral bond scheme was not perfect, but neither was the system before the electoral bond scheme, which was basically cash and black money that was being given to to political parties without us knowing it. Now, let me address this in two or three parts. The first is that nobody disagrees that the system in our country of political party funding was not perfect. Like I started by saying that there was lack of transparency. It was allowing companies to give large amounts of cash and therefore increasing black money. But what we did have information about as voters was any money that was given through the banking channel. So if anybody made a donation to a political party through the banking channel, it would be registered. Voters would be able to find out about it. At least regulators knew about it. What unfortunately the electoral bond system did was that even money coming through the banking channels became anonymous. So, in fact, in that sense, it was far more regressive, because earlier, at least a political party would have to argue that this amount was less than 20,000 rupees. So,
Right.
we don't have to give you information on the donor. Now, it could be 20,000 crore rupees, but as long as it came through the electoral bonds, the voter doesn't need to know who the donor is. So
Means there
this,
was that effort of creative accounting that had to be done.
yes, so this in many ways just totally legitimized anonymous funding to political parties. Now, some of this was done, ostensibly to say that cash donations will come down because donors will not be scared. Very often they give cash because they're scared, and they don't want their name to come out because they're worried that there will be repercussions from other political parties. Now, other political parties mainly means the ruling party, because they might fear that, they will use the agencies against them, etc., etc. Now, if one understands, the electoral bonds were not untrackable. That is something that has now come out very clearly. They had a unique alphanumeric number. So the SBI, which was the government bank, always knew who was buying and giving to which political party. So it was not difficult for the government and therefore the ruling party to know the names of donors who were giving to other opposition parties. So that protection, which was supposed to be brought in and for which these bonds were brought in, was obviously not there because, yes, people didn't know, opposition parties didn't know, but certainly the ruling party knew. So if they wanted to act against donors of opposition parties, they could have done it. Now, having said that, we are in a situation where the Supreme Court very squarely examined this point that the earlier system of cash was not better. And should we have electoral bonds to prevent cash and black money from coming in? And they actually summed it up very, very, beautifully, because what the court has noted is that cash and the black economy is not being impacted necessarily through electoral bonds. Because like I said, although electoral bonds on paper are prohibited from trading, but in fact, there's no safeguard to stop their trading. So like I explained, I could buy the bond, of course, through the banking channel in white money, so as we call it, but then sell it for a consideration and get cash, and the black money actually gets converted into white. So the court therefore was that this doesn't actually provide the safeguard that it is said to provide to stop cash and the black money economy, because the donor doesn't have to be the purchaser. That trading is possible. So, while we are being told that this is actually shifting everything to the banking channels, in effect, the court in a very, very powerful way established that that is not the case. The second thing which also the court asked the government council very clearly was that, have you stopped taking cash? Have political parties stopped taking cash? To which the Solicitor General had to say that they haven't, because under the law, cash was still allowed. The only change that was made was that instead of 20,000 rupees, now basically what was being said is that cash can only be taken up to 2,000 rupees.
Right.
So I mean, further creative accounting. So instead of 19,900, you will have vouchers made of 1,900 rupees and just break it into further smaller packets. So the court then said that, well, cash is continuing to come into political parties. So what anyone who wants to give cash is doing it anyway. You are actually making these bonds tradable. No safeguards are provided. So there is money laundering that is very possible through this. So whatever little benefit that you might say there might be of cash being replaced by the banking channel is certainly not outweighing what is the harm that is coming out of the electoral bonds. So the court applied what it called the double proportionality test and then ruled that electoral bonds were unconstitutional because they failed the proportionality test. So essentially, Apoorva, coming to your original question, that how as voters are we to make sure that we are able to actually realize our right to know? I think the only way to do it is if there is transparency in political party funding and in the functioning of political parties. Now, 2013, there was a very seminal order of the Central Information Commission, where the commission ruled that 6 national political parties are public authorities under the RTI Act. So actually, the CIC said that they are taking lots of public funds. There's a great deal of public interest in knowing what political parties are doing, where they're getting their funds from, how are they functioning, and therefore they ruled that they have to come under the RTI Act and they have to respond to you and I as citizens when we ask for information from them. Now, what we call, which can only be termed as uncivil disobedience, for the past 11 years, we haven't had any political party submitting itself to the RTI Act. It's been 11 years. No court has given a stay on that order, but no political party is willing to give us information. Now, if we have to be really informed, which is what the court has said. As voters, we have to be informed. The
Right.
only way to do it is if we are able to query our political parties. And I would go further than even funding, Apurva. When
Right.
I go to cast my vote, political parties promise me the moon. It's not just one, any political party you look at. So somebody will tell me that we stand for women's empowerment and safety. But
Hmm.
then when it comes to giving candidates tickets to candidates, they'll give it to people who have all these cases of heinous crimes against women.
Right.
Or they will be seen to protect rapists. Now, why should I not have the right to ask the political party that I support that how are you taking these decisions? I mean, there is a lot of public interest in people having the right to query their political parties through the RTI. So
Hmm.
I think that if we want to truly move towards an informed citizenry, informed voters, the RTI Act must be applicable to political parties. They must submit themselves to the RTI. And I really do think that this judgment is, very seminal, not just in the fact that it has declared electoral bonds unconstitutional, but in the way in which it has upheld voters' right to know as
Right.
citizens our right to information. So I think that it will really further the struggle for greater accountability and transparency in the working of political parties and in the political system itself.
Right. It's of course a two-step forward
Of course.
right now, and the next step, as from your answer, it seems like is bringing political parties, making them more accountable, making them more transparent, and having them respect the decision on them being under the Right to Information Act, and letting voters know what they need to know before making that choice on the ballot box. Thank you so much for that discussion, ma'am. And as for our viewers, I'm sure you got a lot of tips on how to be better informed as voters and what can be done next now that we have this judgment, this very important judgment, and we have this data, and we may get more data on electoral bonds. Thank you so much for watching. As for the judgment, I want our readers to probably have have more access to the judgment as well, so I'm going to put a link for the judgment in the description of this video, and links to all the articles that we have written on the judgment so far. I had also done a property called Pass Forward, where I look at political funding, a very detailed article. I'm going to add a link to that article as well. So here's a lot of resources for all of you to read more on political funding generally and on electoral bonds as well. Thank you so much for watching.